Madeline here with Deeper Roots Ministry. I know I'm not the only one who's on the struggle bus when it comes to reading the Old Testament. Sometimes it can feel like, despite our best intentions, despite our desire to read the Old Testament, despite our Bible reading plans, we just can't get into it. We just don't understand what's going on. Sometimes you read parts of the Old Testament and you literally think, I don't understand what I just read, right? That's why today I want to share with you a strategy that has completely transformed how I read the Old Testament. It's a strategy that you can apply to reading any passage of the Old Testament, any verse in the Old Testament, any crazy story in the Old Testament, and best of all, it's quick and it's only 3 questions, okay? So let's get started. This strategy is 3 questions. 3 questions that when you're reading any part of Scripture, you can ask yourself. The first question is this: what does this passage reveal about God? So, in any part of Scripture, you can always find something about God's character, right? And parts of the Old Testament that maybe you see Israel kind of fighting other nations, or you read something about God punishing someone and it's confusing. So, when I read those kind of passages, you might start realizing, well, what this shows me is that God is serious about dealing with sin. God is serious about evil. He's serious about the problem of evil. Or God is serious about justice. That's the first question. There's always something that you're going to learn about God. However, the next question helps give context to that first question, because you could say, well, what this passage of Scripture reveals to me is that God is an angry, mean God, right? The next question we have to ask ourselves is, how does this passage point to Jesus, right? Jesus always has to be central in our understanding of the Old Testament. In other words, we have to read the Old Testament in context of the New Testament. So if I do read a passage where it's some crazy story, or I feel like I see a part of God that makes me question his mercy or his love, I can ask myself, but how does this point to Jesus? Okay, if God had to strike someone down for something, that passage points to Jesus because it says, God was serious about sin, and this passage points to Jesus because I can see that instead of being punished for sin, now we have atonement through Jesus, so I don't have to be struck down for doing something, right? The last question you can ask yourself when reading the Old Testament is this: what does this tell me about my relationship with God? So, one of the biggest complaints I hear about the Old Testament is that it doesn't make sense in the context of today. How does this apply to my life? First of all, I want to say that there's more reason to read Scripture than just something giving you something, right? We don't want to be individualistic in the way that we're reading Scripture. But at the same time, Scripture does teach us that all Scripture is profitable for teaching. So we know that there's always something that we can gain and learn about our relationship with God through any part of Scripture. I'm actually going to include an example of these questions, and I used a passage about Adam and Eve. So, reading that passage about Adam and Eve, I learned that sin disrupted their relationship with him, right? What does that tell me about my relationship with God? It tells me that God is always the first to want to establish a relationship. He was the first one to create me, He was the first one to know me, and even in sin, He wanted to find a way that we could be together. It tells me that I can pursue relationship with God because I can have confidence that He wants to pursue one back with me, right? This is just an easy, quick strategy for reading any passage of the Old Testament. Apply these 3 questions, and I promise you it will help you gain some clarity. What does this reveal about God? How does this passage point to Jesus? And what does this tell me about my relation with God? The answers won't always pop up back at you, but sometimes these questions are just a lens that you can be reading with, that you can meditate on, think about, reflect a little bit about if it's a harder passage of Scripture to really understand. I also recommend get into some commentaries, see what other people have said about this passage of Scripture, and that might help you answer some of those questions more quickly, more effectively too. Like I said, I'm going to include an example, a link to an example in the comments below, and I hope that you'll comment and tell me if you found this helpful. See you soon. Bye.